Welcome back, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Stacia Garr and Priyanka Mehrotra from RedThread Research. Actually, my favourite analysts in the space at the moment. They're both doing, and the wider team at RedThread are doing some amazing stuff. They regularly feature in my monthly countdown of best articles and best research. So thank you for doing that. I know you're here to talk about the people analytics technology restudy that you've been doing, and obviously at Insight 222 and at PAFOW, we're proud to be able to sponsor what is groundbreaking research in our space. I know from the many conversations I have with practitioners that navigating the technology market in our space can be confusing and difficult, and you guys are providing a lot more sense around that to help practitioners and frankly me and others like me to be able to do that. So I think last year was the first year that you did the study, but now this is the second year. So I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more, and I'm going to pass the baton over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the kind words and for featuring our work and sharing kind of everything that we're trying to do. So we're big fans of you as well, so thank you. Just want to say hello, good morning, good afternoon, and probably good evening for a few of you. Thanks so much for listening to Priyanka and me share a bit about this new research. So just by a very quick way of introduction, as David said, I'm Stacia Garr, co-founder of RedThread Research, and I'm joined here by Priyanka Mehrotra, who is really the one who does most of the work, as I tell every vendor we talk to about the research that we're doing. So as David mentioned, this is our second year of doing this study, and RedThread is, just get these slides going. Right, so RedThread is a human capital research advisory analyst firm. We cover people analytics, as David mentioned, but we also cover a number of the other things including learning and career performance, employee experience, etc. So in terms of what we're going to discuss today, we're going to share, for those of you who haven't participated in the research or didn't come to a PAFOW show last year, a little bit about our research journey and calling out some of the things that are a bit different. We're going to share with you what we expected to see this year when we turned the new year, and then what we actually saw in the research. And then share a little bit more about kind of the longer term evolution that we're seeing in the people analytics technology space. Wrap that up with a report card. So kind of compared to what we saw last year, what we have seen, some recommendations both for vendors as well as for practitioners, and then what we expect to see moving forward. I want to underscore that this is a preview of our findings. So the actual study isn't going to publish until the first part of November, and the tool is actually going to be coming out here in just a couple weeks. But we're previewing what we're going to be publishing, but it's not everything, I can guarantee. So with that, I want to go ahead and make sure that we again say thank you to PAFOW and to Insight 222. As David mentioned, they have sponsored our work, and that enables us to do this great work. All right, so in terms of our journey and what's new, David, you mentioned that it's a challenging vendor landscape, and it certainly is. One of the things I feel like has happened, if those of you who have heard me talk last year, I used the story of going to a Thai market and how you go into the market and there's kind of all these different vendors who have all these different things, and it's kind of difficult to sort out. And I feel like maybe we've gotten a little bit farther along in that it's not quite, at least for us, the same in that we don't know all these different vendors and what they're offering. We've now at least kind of thinking about it like a grocery store. Like we at least now know who goes in which aisles and what sorts of things they do. But we're also still seeing lots of new vendors on the market, so new things that we could buy. And so the categorization is useful, but we also need to keep on doing the work. So here's the work that we've done so far. We began in May this year, put a little bit of a later start this year because of COVID, and we began to understand what people most wanted to know this year. And some of the things we learned was a real focus on the importance of customer stories and impact. And so, as well as a lot more on data integration and some of the newer technologies around AI and machine learning. So you're going to see some of that today. So after that poll in May, we did a vendor survey and customer poll. So that makes up the body of the data that we're going to share with you today. But that also represents a big difference with this customer poll. Last year, we spoke with customers. This year, due to COVID, we thought a poll was more appropriate. And that's actually enabled us to get a whole bunch more data from customers. And you'll see some of that today. Moving on, we did our vendor briefings. So every vendor that we see in the study, we do between 60 and 90 minutes with them. And that gives us a chance to see what they've done in the last year, what their direction is, and this year, how they responded to COVID, et cetera. Today's our preview of findings. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to be doing a publication of a detailed tool and the report in the October and November timeframe. And then we will do at the next show, at the next PAFOW show, kind of our final findings. So today's a preview, but we'll do our full final findings, sharing with you all everything that we learned that we can obviously do in 50 minutes. So that's where we are. I want to tell you, and I don't think we shared this data last year, but I want to tell you a little bit about the solution types that are actually in this study. And so we are pretty heavily weighted on the employee experience and multi-source analysis platforms, as you can see here. And for those of you who haven't seen the previous studies, when we talk about a multi-source analysis platform, what we mean is those platforms that will pull in data from just pretty much any source, and we'll integrate it together and help you derive insights from that. And then you can see a fair smattering of other folks, so labor market analysis, O&A, et cetera. This year in this study, we had 45 individual vendors, and so that was up from 37 last year, and actually represents a few folks fall off, so we actually had more than that increase of 8 folks, or of 8 vendors, excuse me. But what you see here represents 53 individual solutions, because some vendors do share multiple solutions. So let's say they are a multi-source analysis platform and a workforce planning platform. For the sake of this, what we're sharing today, they are counted twice. Okay, so if we put ourselves back to when we published the study, the last study, and literally Priyanka and I published it, I think, on December 30th. So this kind of represents exactly what we were thinking. So we were looking at 2020, and we had some really high expectations for the market. So here's what we said last year. We said, hey, we are seeing this incredible revenue growth, this incredible customer growth, and we absolutely expect that to continue. You can literally see, this is our slide, and you can see the spot for 2020 and how high we expected it to go. So that was one thing that we saw. Another thing we saw last year was we talked about the need for greater market differentiation. So we heard from a lot of vendors about a lot of things that were similar, and I'll talk a little bit later about what those were. But we said, okay, here are some of the things we hope to see differently next year. And things like being able to pull together disparate data sources more easily, greater focus on privacy, security, compliance, ethics, confidentiality, et cetera, to Christina's point just a few moments ago. More on passive data collection, et cetera. So you could see some of the things we thought were likely going to happen, or that we hoped would happen in 2020. And then a few other things we talked about that we thought were important. So we thought that technology for development would be a thing, particularly individual development. So I'm getting data as an individual employee that will enable me to do things differently, to develop my capabilities as a manager, et cetera. We talked about employee ownership of data, and I know Christina just said that she didn't like that concept of ownership of data, which I'd actually like to explore a little bit more and understand that more. But we talked about how that, and particularly this idea of potentially blockchain and enabling employees to take their data with them, could become more of a thing in 2020. We also talked about the rise of passive data, as well as a greater focus on data ethics and privacy. So this is what we expected for 2020. And then, obviously, COVID hit. And everyone's worlds just completely shifted. So come the April-May timeframe, one of the things that Priyanka and I spent a bunch of time thinking about is, what are vendors actually doing to help their practitioners, their customers, handle data or handle COVID better? And so there are basically 3 things that we want to tell you about in terms of what we saw. And we're sharing this with you because we see many of these things are going to carry forward. They have across the summer, but then also we expect them to carry forward into 2021. So the 3 biggest things. First was we saw a shifted sales model. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Second, we saw an incredible focus on helping organizations understand employee needs quickly. I think Al and I actually even had a LinkedIn exchange about how in some ways it made us teary to see the incredible response of both vendors and practitioners in helping organizations understand what people needed, get people to the right place, get them the resources they needed, and enable them to rise to this COVID challenge. And then the third thing was an increased focus on delivering value specifically to people analytics practitioners. So I'm going to talk about the first point, and then Priyanka's going to talk about the second two. So on the first one, when we talk about this shifted sales model, what do we specifically mean? So the first was we heard a lot about vendors focusing on strengthening existing models, existing relationships, excuse me. So when we talk about, when we ask vendors kind of what's happening with COVID, how are you responding, how are your customers responding, and what's that doing from a sales perspective, what we generally heard was that, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, that all new customer relationships was on ice. Like no one was kind of, or very few were looking to focus in on new relationships. But what we heard a lot of was that people who had an instance of a vendor in place, that there was a real focus on expanding that relationship, making sure that the practitioners got value out of what they already had purchased, and enabling them to really rise and meet that challenge that they were facing. So that was the general theme. However, there was a second component of this, which was how vendors were trying to get some of those new customers, and particularly the employee experience vendors, trying to get new and engagement vendors, trying to get new customers in. And we saw, I think for the first time, certainly in a long time, a rise of the freemium product. So what we heard from some of the vendors was offering particularly pulse surveys around COVID for free, and many of them for a 90-day trial to let people immediately get the insights they needed on their workforce. And then with and I will say, I heard by and large a truly altruistic approach, saying we are doing this because this is the one thing we as a business can do to help in this COVID crisis. We as a vendor business can help in the COVID crisis. Over time, of course, there was a hope that these would turn into longer term relationships. And what we've been hearing is that is increasingly the case. So we've heard some pretty strong numbers in terms of how many folks have transitioned into customers. But at the beginning, it really was this freemium model, which was, we thought, an interesting shift. And what we're starting to see, or what we've seen from the data, is that vendors expect this focus, this dual focus on existing customers, strengthening that relationship, and then this freemium model of kind of offering value to new customers and then transitioning them over. They expect that to pay off. We also, I should say that in the last 4 weeks or so, we've heard that the relationships that had kind of been on ice, the new relationships have started to unthaw, and we're starting to see some spending come back. So if we think about what does this actually mean for the market, we see that vendors are expecting this focus to pay off. So last year, if we looked across the 3 previous years, we saw a customer compound annual growth rate of about 21%. And then when we compare that to this year, the customer growth rate that vendors expect to happen in 2020, it's 38%. So these are new customers. This is not necessarily growth within that existing customer base. So it's interesting to see. We may be seeing a bit of over enthusiasm in terms of what's actually going to happen. I think that there's a big question mark on what's going to happen this fall, and that's going to ultimately impact this number. But if this 38% does hold, then across kind of the new 3-year average would be a 25% compound annual growth rate in terms of customer growth. So pretty interesting. All right, Priyanka, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to talk about what the vendors did to help organizations.
Thank you. So the second way that we saw vendors respond to the crisis was by helping organizations understand their employee needs quickly. And there were 2 main ways that we saw this. One, they increased their focus in certain areas that needed more attention. And 2, they began providing COVID-19 specific offerings. And I'm going to talk about the first point a little bit more here. So as you can see, data from our survey results reveal that a greater number of vendors are now focusing on D&I and employee experience than they did in 2019. We know that one of the main challenges that organizations have faced during the crisis has been to understand and keep a check on how employees are feeling on a frequent basis and ensure that different groups are feeling included and connected in a virtual environment. And so we can see there's been a jump of more than 15% among vendors stating D&I as their primary area of focus, and an increase of more than 10% for those focusing on employee experience. So we can see that the vendor market is swift in shifting their focus as needed. We've been able to do that by including different metrics and modules that can help users quickly uncover insights around these areas. And this takes us to our next point. Vendors are doing to provide COVID-specific offerings. So let's talk about some of the examples that we've seen when it comes to specific things by vendors in different categories. First category, we saw quite a few vendors in our employee experience and engagement category launch dedicated surveys for COVID. Now, as we know, one of the major priorities for organizations during this crisis has been keeping their remote workforce engaged and ensuring a positive employee experience. We saw vendors step up, provide tools and resources that focus on employee listening, communications, well-being, transparency, collaboration, etc., by helping us adjust their pulse surveys. Additionally, vendors such as Qualtrics and Perceptics began offering surveys that allow organizations to understand how and when employees should return to work by assessing their confidence levels and sentiments. Now, moving to the multi-source analysis category, we saw vendors really help organizations integrate and manage the new data that they were collecting to track the crisis, analyze its effects on the workforce, and conduct advanced analytics such as what-if scenarios and what-if analysis and scenario planning. And more specifically, vendors new out-of-the-box analysis for COVID-19. So giving an example here, Vizio, for example, began offering its customers the ability to compare workforce data with publicly available Johns Hopkins COVID-19 data within all their solutions, giving them the ability to see different peaks and future projections for the pandemic for different geographies. Now, in the next category, we have employee coaching, where an example we have is that of Cultivate, that has been focused on helping individuals become more self-aware and improve digital communications. Again, something so important in this pandemic. The vendor recently launched a new feature called Team Dynamics that measures how people perform and work together and delivers feedback and assistance to help leaders and employees be better aligned on communications and their preferences. And lastly, in our analysis category, we heard from M-Level, who built partnerships and content on COVID training, mental health, and well-being to help individuals cope with anxiety and isolation, a very critical area during the pandemic. And through these partnerships, the vendor was able to make these resources on well-being accessible to a wider community. So these are just the examples that we heard from all those that the vendors shared with us. So now that we've discussed what the vendors did and how they did it, let's look at whom the vendors focused their efforts on. And that takes us to a finding, which is that vendors increased focus on people analytics practitioners. So our third finding revealed that vendors have over the past year increased their focus on delivering value to people analytics practitioners. And as you can see, this was reflected in our survey data as well. 96% of vendors selected people analytics practitioners as their current primary end user. And the fact that this number has risen by almost 20% since the last year, we believe it's likely a reflection of two things. One, we have a higher number of multi-source analysis platforms this year, and those solutions with their advanced analytic capabilities primarily tend to cater to people analytics leaders and teams. And two, a rise in the need and demand for deeper analytics among existing customers to make workforce predictions, adjust headcounts, and gain access to insights needed to help them make decisions during the crisis. Very quickly, we're just going to take a look at how vendors are serving the people analytics practitioners. So our survey data revealed that about 2/3 of vendors are providing customized insights and recommending analysis that are relevant for people analytics practitioners. And as you can see, about half of them are able to suggest personalized for them. And it would that overall, on average, users seem quite satisfied with these capabilities reflected in the that we received. So we go to the next slide. So you see that we have a score. I think it's not loading on my end. Yes, there we go. Sorry. So here we have a customer NPS score. So this is the average of NPS scores we received for 22 vendors as of week. And to put it in a bit more context, average score SaaS industry 2020. So we would say 67 scores, pretty good. And I can see from the data on the bottom left, almost all vendors received a score higher than 30. However, we do want to point out that this feedback is based on customers by the vendors. So just wanted to highlight that. So all the practitioners who have joined us today, love to hear the score or not. If you're analytic to a vendor or happy past, take our product. We will be making it open for the able future. And we look forward to receiving your feedback. And with that, I will hand it over to Stacia for our next section.
Great, thank you, Priyanka. I think there's just a little bit of slide delay here. So I talked a little bit a few moments ago about the larger scale evolution that we're seeing. So obviously vendors responded to what they saw with COVID, but they also had longer term roadmaps in place. And so we want to share a little bit about some of the other changes that we saw. So first, one of my biggest complaints last year was that we weren't seeing very clear vendor value propositions. And we did see a pretty big shift in that this year. And so I'm going to share a bit more about what we're seeing and why we think that's a good thing. Second, and Priyanka's going to dive into this in more detail, is we saw much more natural language processing and text analysis capabilities come out of the vendors. And this makes us happy, and I know it's going to make Al happy, a greater focus on ethics. And so Priyanka's going to talk a little bit more about that one as well. So let's start here with the clearer vendor value proposition. So last year, what we saw was that most vendors told us that these were their differentiators, that they were easy to use, they were customizable, they had short time to implement, and they were scalable and flexible. Now, if most people are telling you that that's their differentiator, then those things are not actually differentiators. They are foundational to what you have to be able to do to compete in the market. And that was our message back to the market last year. And so this year, I think that folks kind of really got that, and we heard a much different story. So here are some of the things that we actually heard in terms of the difference that vendors feel they offer to potential customers. So the first is around domain expertise. And so I'm going to share a little bit more specifically about what we mean there, but we heard a lot more about the value of either professional services or kind of the science, and we've got that second methodology in science. People really trying to share, this is what we do and how we do it differently that will enable our customers to be more successful. And so so those were a couple of things that we heard. And the thing that's important here is that the differences actually were meaningful. The second one is around actionability. Or I'm sorry, the third one, excuse me. So we saw some vendors who really are doing some things to enable their customers to be much more actionable and much more able to drive change within organizations. And then finally, we saw more around scalability and flexibility. So that was one from last year, but what was interesting was that we saw vendors actually sharing with us different ways that was happening. So if we move on here to the next slide, this is just an example of how we might be providing some level of technical expertise. So for instance here, this is for HR business partners, but we can see that that some of the vendors are helping provide technical expertise to help HRBPs understand the data and metrics, and then also seeing more resources and references to help HRBPs understand how to use the solution. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep going because I'm not, I think Priyanka was going to, but she seems to have stepped away for a moment. So moving on to natural language processing and text analysis. We saw some real, oh, okay. All right, go for it.
Sorry, I switched off my video with bandwidth issues, but I can take over, not a problem.
Okay, perfect.
So great. So one of that we had highlighted in our last year's research and hoped we would see a greater focus on in the future was sophisticated languages. And as you can see, our survey results did reveal that vendors have made some investments in advancing these capabilities. So specifically on the left, as you can see, 40% of vendors report that they offer NLP capabilities to help customers identify emotions and sentiments. And while 36% reported that they conduct comment analysis, including collection and identifying themes, our briefings did reflect that they're starting to take a more thoughtful and invest approach to language analysis. So looking at the next slide, here are just some of the examples of the new and interesting ways we are seeing NLP in action. And these include applying narrative intelligence capability to performance conversations, reviews, feedback, and then connecting that to learning and development. So that is something that we thought was really interesting. Additionally, we saw an example of how corporate communications can be analyzed to understand toxicity and levels of bias in comments and feedback, thus helping companies deepen their D&I initiatives. And another great example we saw from a text analysis focused vendor was that they are offering value to customers by visualizing how ideas are linked, which ideas are dominant within different segments of employees, and which themes are developing, thus guiding the decision maker to areas that need their attention and action. So moving to our which is ethics. So again, in our study last year, we made a call to vendor almost half the surveyed vendors were leaving it up to practitioners and customers to take a lead when it came to these issues. I'm sorry, it seems like I'm still breaking up. Stacia, do you want to take over?
Yeah, why don't I take over? Because for me anyway, it's still breaking up pretty badly. So, okay. Just make sure we get the slides on the right spot. So I think Priyanka, you were saying that we've seen a real focus on ethics, and for instance, this is some data that it is better than last year. So we saw 64% of vendors saying that they design systems that protect employees and educate HR and as well as leaders. I will say also, though, one of the biggest shifts that we saw was last year, we had a lot of new vendors come into this space, and many people who had come from other parts of the world. So maybe marketing or security or other parts that have maybe mastered data and predictions in a way different than we have within people analytics, or they certainly feel like they have a set of expertise that they can bring to the people analytics space. And so we heard a lot of folks coming in and saying, well, we're going to do this and we're going to provide this really detailed information down to the employee level, directly to the manager, et cetera, et cetera. And I will say that part of our job as analysts was to say, okay, let's maybe just slow that down a little bit, because there's a lot of other things happening in this space that you may not understand in terms of the privacy or ethics implications of some of the things that you're suggesting. Anyway, so this year we saw a number of those completely change their tune. I will say, like from briefings last fall to briefings over the summer, we just saw a completely different recognition of the importance of data, ethics, and privacy, and a much greater focus on how are we going to be thoughtful about the data, how are we going to make sure employees know what we're doing with the data, and the types of analyses. And some of that obviously is driven by some of the legislation, whether that's GDPR or the legislation here in California. But I think also some of it's driven by you all, by the practitioners who are saying, hey, this isn't going to work. You need to be aware of these other things. So I think that, last year at this time, I was extremely concerned, and I still remain pretty concerned. But I think that we saw some really good progress here, and want to make sure that we kind of give that credit where credit is due. A little bit of data here that comes from the survey. So we found about 2/3 of vendors are helping customers increase data transparency. So you see there about 69% being transparent around access to the data. the duration it will be stored for, and the purpose that it's being used for. So some of those are obviously GDPR, but some of those are not. And then about the same number being transparent about the data that is actually being collected. So if we kind of pull this up and we think about what did we see last year, and kind of I've been thinking about this almost like the report card, and then what do vendors still need to work on? So if we go back to what we expected to see in 2020, if we give it kind of a, like I said, a report card, there were two things that we think we saw some real progress on that we expected to see progress on. So that ethics, privacy, security, etc. And then second, the sophisticated language analysis. So we saw quite a bit of focus on that area. The areas that we didn't see much focus on that we expected to, and we'd encourage folks to continue to work on, is pretty much everything else on the slide. So yes, we still see a focus on pulling together different and disparate data sources, but I would argue that it's still not simple and that there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made in this area. Passive data collection. So we see passive data, as we said last year, we still see that as an incredibly important new source of data. And we're going to, and particularly for those vendors who are more on our data creator side, so who are actually, surveying data, et cetera, we think that there's an opportunity for them to kind of open the aperture and combine that objective data, that the data about what's actually happening with sentiment data, and to provide greater insights. In our survey, we did not see a movement on this number. It was exactly the same this year versus last year, which surprised me. Community collective intelligence. So we would expect for folks to be doing more, particularly during this time, to support their HR business partners, the people analytics practitioners, et cetera. We didn't see any meaningful movement in terms of doing that, in terms of giving people access to a community that helps them. I think in many ways, that's actually why this PAFOW community is so powerful and so important, is that you do get that access to that broader community within this community. And I think that's a really special thing about PAFOW. And then storytelling. We didn't see a lot of movement on the storytelling. And I think this remains one of the biggest areas for improvement, particularly when we're thinking about HR business partners and HR leaders, C-suite executives, managers, employees. So basically everybody but the people analytics practitioner, those who don't have the same level of data sophistication, we need to be better at storytellers. So we didn't see much movement there. If we were to grade ourselves on how we did in terms of looking forward, I think you can see there's two things that, there are two things that we think really we saw change on. So data ethics and privacy I just mentioned, but also technology for development. So this was one of the most interesting things that happened out of COVID, was we did hear a lot of organizations talking about sharing more information with employees, particularly the employee engagement and employee experience vendors who are trying to get more data into the hands of managers who could actually do something to help employees with COVID. So that was a big shift that we saw this year in terms of just, trying to get more data out there. Now, as I said, I think there could be more structure around that data and there could be more storytelling around it, but we did see a shift there. We did not see these two things, the employee ownership of data and more passive data, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And then, so if we look at what we're calling kind of homework for the next year for our vendors in terms of what we'd hope that they would work on. First, everything from 2019 that I just mentioned. Second, being clearer about the value, I'm going to build this next one, the value that's being offered to business leaders, managers, and employees. So yes, seeing them as primary users, but I'm being much more thoughtful about the insights and recommendations. So my personal kind of bugaboo, and those who briefed with me this year will know, is that I wanted folks to focus on the importance of what business leaders actually care about and what the data tells them about that. So a lot of dashboards focus on just, okay, here's where we saw the biggest change. Sales folks turned over at this rate this year, or our marketing folks turned over at this rate. And my pushback was, well, if I'm a business leader, maybe marketing's not differentiating to my particular business, and maybe I'm totally cool if we're losing people. comparatively speaking. But if I lose my salespeople or if I lose my engineers, maybe that's what I really care about. And so enabling us to share that information, to tell that story that says, this is the thing you told us you cared about, and this is the data that actually tells you something meaningful about what happened, making sure that organizations are able to do that, because we did not see that universally, for sure. And then the other thing I really want to have a conversation about is diversity, equity, and inclusion. You heard us talk about COVID ad nauseum. Obviously, social justice issues happened this summer too, or happened in 2020. Over the course of the summer, they burst into the forefront. And when we asked, what are you doing about DE&I? We heard, you saw a greater focus on D&I, we're offering more, but we didn't actually get much meat. We didn't get, and we know that some of that is that customers are not necessarily comfortable, but we think sharing what's happening. But we'll talk to anybody anonymously. And we think that there is a story that we need to tell about how we use people data for good in service of DE&I. And we want to be able to tell that story next year. And so our ask would be that folks start to think about how is it that we can enable DE&I beyond just looking at representation numbers or pipeline numbers, but how can we do it in a way that focuses on inclusion in the network, et cetera. Okay, I just wanted to share with you real quick, just to double down on one of those points, was around the capabilities for different folks. So we see that with BPs, there was a focus on self-service. Very high numbers that were kind of shared as self-service for some of the different practitioners and audiences that our vendors are focused on. But when we asked actually, how are you helping them? Are you helping them provide personalized actions or customized insights? We didn't see numbers at kind of at the levels that we would hope for. So this is maybe a note of caution or awareness for our practitioner friends out there. When you're asking about kind of who does this vendor serve and what resources do we have to scale across the organization, it is not, you need to be careful to understand exactly what they are actually offering, because everyone will tell you that they offer self-service or they offer something, and they do, and that's important. But understand if that actually meets the needs of your specific audience that's beyond just the people analytics practitioner and leader. So that's kind of our key point there. And then some more recommendations for practitioners. We'd like you to ask your vendors to focus those dashboards on the true insights, as I said, not just kind of what's changed in the data. Incorporate insightful recommendation actions into the dashboards themselves, where people can just go and they can dig and they can run all these hypotheses and scenarios. But we know that outside the people analytics practitioner, most folks either don't have the interest, the time, the data sophistication, et cetera, to do that. And so what we would like to see is vendors actually use their machine learning to run through kind of expected hypotheses of what people might care about and to bubble that up. Now, will it always be the right thing? Absolutely not. But we all know that it's easier to react to something that we're shown than to necessarily hypothesize something out of the air. And so we would just push to have kind of ideas and insights actually presented right there in terms of what is happening and what people should go do that will spark conversations. Another one, and this comes directly from one of the customer poll comments, is we heard from a number of folks about the importance of when you're going through implementation, making sure that your vendor can meet you at the level of implementation need that you have. So larger organizations have more often, not always obviously, have more resources to support an implementation, but some of our small and medium-sized businesses, they might only have one practitioner, maybe two. And so we heard from a number of folks about how there seemed to just be a level of higher expectation with than what the vendor, than what they actually could do. And so being very planful from the beginning about the level of support needed. All right. Okay, so then just in terms of what we see moving forward, what we see coming, we see a move towards vendors using active and passive data more. So these are our predictions for the future. I highlighted this one, but we think that is going to increasingly be a thing. So if you are only in one camp or the other, if you're only a data integrator or you are only a data creator, we think that you need to think about how can you integrate the other type of data into your offering. So that's the first point. Second point that will reinforce that is, at least in the short term, we expect to see more vendors entering into partnerships that will enable them to deliver kind of that passive and active value to their customers. That said, because of those partnerships and that need, we also anticipate that there's probably going to be quite a bit of market consolidation come the next 18 months. So if you are a practitioner, keep that in mind in terms of thinking about the vendors that you're partnering with and what may eventually happen with them. Serve you, let's say, 18, 24 months down the road. And then finally, a greater use of more unstructured data. So we're talking about voice, video, images, etc. We've seen a few vendors beginning to do some of this, particularly around voice, but we're expecting that we're going to start to see a lot more of that come, again, the next 12 to 18 months. So, as I mentioned, this is just a preview of the findings. We're working through a whole lot more data that we have both from the customer poll as well as from the vendors. So two things for you to look out for. One is a robust online tool that will be coming in mid-October. So for some of those that you have maybe seen what we did last year, the tool is being completely rebuilt, and the tool is going to hold a lot of the data that was actually in the reports last year. So the tool is the first thing that Priyanka and I are focusing on, and we think about 10 business days out from having that ready to go. And then we will be releasing a research summary that will come out in early November, and that will summarize the things that we see across the overall market. That will also give an updated 2x2 map. So some of you listening today may have expected to see the 2x2. It's not quite ready. It's almost there, but we need to still share it with a few more vendors. So the tool and the have overall market size, which we didn't share today, and it will have a whole bunch of other things, particularly around data integration as well as customer feedback. So you'll be able to see both of those at our website at redthreadresearch.com. You'll also be able to see it at PAFOW as well as at Insight 222. So with that, we're going to end our comments. Here's some links to the studies from last year as well as the tool from last year, if you'd like to see that before we get this updated study out. But in the meantime, if you have any comments or thoughts, as I said, Priyanka and I are actively working on getting this across the finish line, so we'd love to hear from you. All right, I think we're ready for any questions or comments. David or Al?
Great. Fantastic, Priyanka and Stacia. Always great to see the stuff, and great to see from my perspective the evolution around privacy and ethics. Because I must admit, when we talked about the findings initially last year, I think we were all a little bit surprised about that, given what we were hearing from the practitioners, and they felt the responsibility of the vendors to kind of meet them halfway around this. So it's good to see progress in that area. One other thing, actually, it's funny, I was talking to, I'm not going to say the organisation, I was talking to an organisation this morning who are rolling out one of the data aggregation tools, integration tools at the moment in their organisation. And they've actually started with the business users. They've started right at the top with the executive leadership team rather than focusing on HR. And is that something you, because you highlighted that, I think, as an area you think is an area of development. Is that something you're seeing in pockets a little bit more this year than maybe last year?
Yeah, definitely. And I think those vendors who are coming in from other spaces, like I mentioned, the security or marketing in particular, they don't necessarily have the relationships with HR or with people analytics. And so they're kind of looking at, overall, we've got this tool that we think can do great things. Who can we get to buy it first? And if they think that they've got a compelling business problem, often they're going to the business leader first. So I'm seeing that more, I would say, in vendors that are coming from outside the space. But we certainly are hearing it with some of our vendors who are kind of more traditionally have served this market in the past, particularly those with that freemium model that I mentioned during COVID. They would have business leaders who came and said, I just need this help and I need it now. And then after the fact, they kind of were backing back into HR and people analytics. So that's definitely something that we've seen.
Okay, and I should say to those that are following on the app that you are able to post a question in the Q&A box. I am flipping between the two as we go. So obviously, I'm not going to ask you to reveal the 2x2 because I appreciate that involves some discussions with vendors. Are you seeing like any new, not necessarily new categories in the 2x2, but growing. You mentioned the employee experience category, which is a big representation, I think, of the vendors that are making up this, and I think the same for the kind of data aggregation tools as well. But then you spoke about O&A. Are you seeing growth in O&A, for example, and what other areas are you seeing growth in this year?
Yeah, so we are seeing growth in O&A, but I think what's interesting about that is it's more, I mentioned that the vendors are, we're seeing more partnership, particularly to bring together different vendor types and different data types, excuse me. So we're seeing O&A in partnership or combination with other vendors. So some of our O&A providers have done some partnerships with the multi-source analysis providers, or they've done it with employee experience providers. So I think what we're starting to see is only kind of getting plugged into other areas. My guess is that next year our 2x2, we're going to have to rethink our 2x2, because I think that everything, if you remember, we had data integrators at the top and data creators at the bottom, and everyone's kind of squishing in the middle. So we're going to have to figure out how do we want to kind of break everybody back out so that we can see that differentiation. So that's what I think we see. Priyanka, do you have any thoughts on anything that might be new categories?
I hope I'm not breaking up still, but I think the only thing I would add is that more than a change in the categories, I think we've seen a bit of deepening of capabilities within them. So like, for example, for multi-source or O&A, we've seen a lot more advancement in existing capabilities. The number of sources that they are integrating data from, I think that's been a significant move in the needle that I would say we're seeing with vendors that we spoke to for sure.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, we saw a lot more integration. Integration of business data than we had last year. So, and I think that might be being driven by what you said, David, of business leaders taking a much more active interest in our space now. So we're seeing that shift this year much more than we saw last year.
And I think what you were saying about the O&A vendors maybe working closer with the multivariate, multi-data sources and maybe the survey vendors, that kind of makes sense because it's a different signal. I mean, I know you Matt, I don't know if you were on earlier, it was very, very early your time, particularly Stacia, with Mehrotra and Manish. And Mehrotra was talking about how they're looking at combining some of that passive network data with the survey data as well. So you've got the different signals coming in just to see if it's telling you the same thing. Particularly, I'm thinking around stuff like remote working and the potential impact on collaboration. Because I think if you ask someone in a survey if they're busy, they're going to say yes, mostly, perhaps. Whereas the passive signal might say something different. So it shows a maturing of the space, I think.
Yeah, and it'll show you, I think, in nuance, right? Like someone could be extremely busy, but if 90% of their emails are to internal stakeholders and they're a salesperson, then this is probably not a good thing. So I think the power of the two data sets together is really remarkable and is something that we're going to start to see people looking to. But what I want to make sure we underscore is that, the perception data, how I feel about my work, how I feel about what I'm doing, how I feel about my company, that is not going to go away in terms of its importance. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal written by, kind of someone who's in our community who talked about, it's time to get away with the annual survey and all this other stuff and continuous, ongoing pulse. But, I think each of these tools has its own value and its own place in what we're doing and how we understand what's happening with our employees. So I would be hesitant to kind of throw something out, maybe reduce the frequency, reduce the approach. But I think each of these tools has a place.
Yeah, and certainly I think most of the companies that I speak to, they keep the annual survey, but they put it alongside more frequent pulsing. And I think, as you've highlighted, more and more asking open text questions and doing natural language processing around that to get a kind of slightly different, deeper view on certain topics. So it's good. Well, actually, given that I think it's 28%, if I can remember properly, were the kind of in the engagement space. I mean, one of the questions that we get a lot from practitioners is getting access to some of that survey data. and putting that into their data lake or other areas, so they can actually start doing analysis on that, and then people analytics teams themselves can start looking at the links between some of that data and some of the other HR data or business data they've got. And obviously, you put the right protections around that, of course. And I think, and the frustration I find from practitioners sometimes is actually either that's not within their contracts or certain vendors won't allow them to have that data. Is that something you came across during the survey? And did practitioners talk about workarounds around that, for example?
So we did ask about it, and now Priyanka, we actually pulled it out at the last minute because we're like, I'm not sure that's that important. Apparently it is. We'll put that back in. But so we asked a question both about whether you could access and export the raw data, if you could export the raw data from the tool, and if you could edit or access it within the tool itself. So a few tools actually would let you do that. So you could go in and kind of make some changes if you needed to within the tool, and then kind of update it to the overall system. And then I think it was the majority would let you export. But I think that the key point you make there, David, is you have to make sure that's in your contract. Priyanka, do you happen to remember what the actual numbers are?
I think I would like to get, what I saw was around 2/3. But I just want to add in a caveat to that, was that the majority of them said that they allow practitioners to export the data, but a fewer number of them said that they would allow them to edit the data. So I just want to point that out, that it wasn't the same amount of same number of vendors who let you edit it, but a majority of them said that they let you export it.
Yeah, but not all. To your point, I agree. That was my recollection.
Yep.
Like it was 2/3 roughly.
Yeah.
And interesting, you say, interesting as well, thinking about, because obviously when the crisis hit, I think there were a few articles by people in our space about how it was a time of reckoning for the HR technology space. But I think it's fair to say that, I share exactly what you said, Stacia. The response from the technology partners in this space has been quite overwhelming. I think, I'm not going to call individual companies out, whether it's offering freemium services or whether it was really going in and working closely with clients so they could get more value out of their investment, or hosting sessions for the community as a whole. I think which there was a lot of that, particularly at the start of the COVID crisis. And in your data, it's self-reported, but a lot of vendors are actually quite bullish about the growth they're expecting this year. It'd be interesting, as you said, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, it will be. They were really bullish. I actually, when Priyanka first did the analysis, I said, "Are you sure? Like, can we go back and do that again? Because, but no, that's what the numbers show, and different from last year. Last year we had just collected kind of the previous 3 years, and we didn't ask for a projection. So this year we did ask for the projection. We explicitly said post-COVID projection for 2020, so we were capturing it. And that's what people said. I think we at RedThread kind of look across a whole bunch of areas, and if I think about what we've seen, there have been two areas that have really come through. We're not out of by any stretch COVID really well. One is learning and development. So technology being available for people to learn at home and learn how to work from home and how to do all the things that are different in this world. And then people analytics. There have been some other areas, performance management, succession, some of these other kind of core talent management areas that I haven't seen nearly. It may have been a reckoning for some of them, but when we talk about people analytics, we by and large have seen real strength. The only exception I would say there is if someone was a brand new vendor, and was trying to get traction with customers. Because of that kind of slamming on the brakes, and I would say now the kind of touchy on and off the brakes. If you think about like going down a hill and you're like, oh, maybe, that's kind of what we're seeing with customers. And so if a vendor was small and didn't have a decently strong customer base, I would say this has probably been a time of reckoning, even in people analytics. But by and large, we've seen just an incredible strength, and we heard that from both vendors as well as practitioners. Now, if that 38% actually turns true, we'll see. We'll see next year. But I don't think in general for this space it's been a reckoning.
which is good, because I mean I think it shows the health of the space. I mean, if you're a technology company supporting the space, and the space is doing reasonably well, certainly comparative to others, then if you've got a good product, I guess you're in a reasonably good position to grow, which maybe we probably didn't think would happen at the outset of the crisis. So, is it? I mean, is there anything that really surprised you in the data? From the survey, pick out maybe a couple of things that really surprised you.
I'll go first. I thought passive data was going to be like the thing this year. I really expected a bigger jump on that. And maybe what it may have been is that with COVID, everyone was just so busy trying to respond that they didn't kind of have the time to think about the transition to a new data source or how they were going to integrate that. But with everybody moving to work from home and so much more being done digitally, I just thought passive was going to be such a thing. And I think it went up literally 1 percentage point. It was just not. So that was the surprise number one. For me, surprise number two was that growth rate number. So I really thought that it was going to be a lot flatter than people are projecting, and it wasn't. So that would be the second one. And then I'm just kind of thinking. Third, I would say the NPS score. So the NPS score was really strong. I am a skeptic. I thought it was going to be quite a bit lower. As Priyanka said, those are based on vendors or based on practitioners that were given to us by vendors. But that didn't prevent some of them from being pretty harsh. So that is not a guarantee of a positive comment. But that strong NPS, I think, I think that was a really good message for the market. I think it was a lot stronger than I anticipated. Priyanka, what about you?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking back to the briefings that we've had, and I think a pleasant surprise that has been for me throughout has been the beautiful visualization and the user experience that we've seen. I think this year we saw a bunch of vendors really hone in and improve their user experience. So they've improved their color palettes, the way they're surfacing the insights, their graphs, charts, and just overall the user experience, I think, has been much better. And one other thing that I wanted to add was this time we did something different, was we asked vendors if they can give us access to their demo environment so that we can go in and test them ourselves. And of course, not all of them were able to do that, but the ones that they did, it was just a great experience going in and testing out those capabilities and seeing those beautiful and actually experiencing that user experience from a practitioner point of view. So I think that has been a pleasant surprise for me this year.
Well, what a great way to end, getting in and playing with the tools. That's great. So Priyanka, Stacia, it's a pleasure as always. Some really great insights. Really looking forward to the full report and full study coming out. Thank you very much.